Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the internet. It's your boy, the 5th round Robbie Lawler / 1st round Anthony Johnson of MMA Media, Jack Slack. It was a fairly standard weekend of fights. There was a UFC event on. It was okay. And there was a Bellator fight that had 18 fights on the card, and one of the fights was good. But before we get into the recaps, let's go to the news. Got some doozies this week. You know, after last week when alpha female Jazzy Gabert, the 0-0 pro wrestler, I think she was 0-0. She certainly fought like she was 0-0. But after she lost to a woman who she outweighed by 40 pounds, you might have been thinking, there's not enough freak show happening at the moment in Japan. But Japan heard you, and Deep Jewels announced that at Deep Jewels 16, 12-year-old Momo will make MMA debut against 24-year-old Momoko Yamazaki. Yamazaki has 5 fights. She's 2-3. She's coming off back-to-back losses, so they thought, how do you get her back in the win column? You give her a 12-year-old. And if you click this story, you know, if you're expecting like maybe an overdeveloped man-child, like 13-year-old Mike Tyson or whatever, no, it looks like, to be honest, it looks like a 10-year-old. What the fuck, Japan? That's all I can say to that. Takes place on May the 20th. And we'll see. Can Deep come in at the last minute and beat Scott Coker to the bottom of the barrel? Jesus Christ. I mean, no one looks good in that fight. If you lose to a 12-year-old girl with no fights. If you win, you beat up a 12-year-old girl with no fights. But this is, you know, just part of Japan's grand history of doing this. Shinasi Sakamoto, whatever her name is, the lassie beat Hisei Watanabe back in the day. She got a 16-year-old who debuted a 0-0 record, and she was at one time like the number 1 pound-for-pound female fighter in the world. I think Watanabe fought the same girl. Yeah, they're happy to sacrifice people. Oh well, at least this girl can roid up if she wants to. In fact, it would be irresponsible of her parents, who presumably let her sign this fight, to not let her roid up. Oh my god, breaking live news. There's been an update to this story since the last time I checked it. There is now training footage of this girl. She's training out of the gym that produced Mizuki, Naoki Inui, other people. Right, let's have a look at this. That was awful. You know, not tremendously encouraging of what will happen if she gets in the ring with a grown woman. But moving on. Elsewhere, World Series of Fighting was rebranded to become the Professional Fighters League, which promises to adopt a league format, meaning that, as they said, everyone gets a shot at the title, which is not exactly how that works, but they have also promised a salary to all fighters, which isn't a great idea in a sport where everyone gets injured all the time. Ask WCW how it worked when they were paying people regardless of whether they showed up. But I don't know who is giving these people money. They just have terrible ideas over and over. Oh, let's have an event at Madison Square Garden on New Year's Eve, the one night of the year that everyone has something else planned already. And they've lost Marlon Moraes, and they're probably going to lose Justin Gaethje soon. I love Ray Safo, but that organisation is doing awfully, and it has the worst ideas I've ever heard. Elsewhere, talking of ideas, a complete lack of ideas, the new episode of The Ultimate Fighter drew the lowest ratings ever. And if you saw it, it was the very first episode that the still of Cody grabbing TJ by the neck came from, so they blew their load on that one. Nothing more to get excited about. I don't know. I thought about doing like a follow-up to each episode of Tough as it happens, just on the YouTube page, but I don't care enough. It's a really bad program. Even when you got great guys like Ryan Hall coming through, it's not worth sitting through for the garbage. You know, if you want to catch up, just watch the fight. And final piece of news, which I thought was really interesting, King Mo is out of the fight with Ryan Bader at Bellator New York City, the pay-per-view. So who stepped in at short notice? Phil Davis, and he's putting his title on the line, which requires massive balls, especially if you've already lost to the guy. So props to Phil Davis, props to Bellator for getting that done, because it's way more interesting than Bader versus King Mo. That's worked out okay. I would say I'm still going to hold off on buying the pay-per-view, because I am 95% certain that the main and co-main event do not make it to the night without being changed. Right, that's that out of the way. Let's get into the recaps from the weekend. If you didn't see, on the YouTube channel, I recorded my first viewing of these fights. It wasn't live because people have been asking me to do a live commentary, having released these, but basically, being a UK citizen living in the UK, if I stay up to watch these events live, about Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm just dead, and then the rest of the week is awful. So yeah, I'll be continuing to release my commentary normally the morning after, I think, big fights, and we'll see how that goes. So if you want to go watch those or listen to those, they're on the YouTube channel. Open them up. If you've got the fights saved, or you can find the fights somewhere, I'm not suggesting anywhere that you should find the fights, but if you happen across them, you can line up the audio of the commentary with the video of the fight, and it should be fairly enjoyable. Because while there were complaints that I don't get excited enough, I'm trying to offer a little bit of technical insight, and it's the standard Jack Slack treatment, where a lot of it's just tangents about other things that have happened historically in the fight game. But you might enjoy it, so go give it a watch or listen. The way it'll work is I'll probably I'll do either the main card or the prelims. I probably won't do the lot, because it's, like 4 hours of fights every time. But yeah, I had fun doing it, so I hope you guys enjoy it. Anyway, Perry versus Ellenberger. This was the very first fight I commentated, and I was wondering if not listening to the sound was making me biased, but throughout I was going like, Mike Perry's striking looks a lot better here than it has previously, and a lot better than Ellenberger's. Ellenberger was throwing the occasional kick, but really not attacking Perry's legs. When Perry's in this long stance with his heels almost on line, a good low kick is going to take him out of his stance and allow Ellenberger to circle off punishment free or step in and deliver some punches. But Ellenberger is obsessed with his hands again. He did throw a couple of nice liver kicks, actually. He's been working with Giga Chikadze, who's a guy in Glory at the moment. And Chikadze's, I think he's a Kyokushin guy, or one of those Kyokushin offshoots, but he kicks really comfortably from both stances, and he changes stances through his combinations. But Ellenberger was just using this really simple start circling, change stance mid-circle, and then throw the left kick into the open side before the opponent has caught up mentally with which stance you're in, and how that's going to change the dynamics of the matchup. It worked a couple of times quite nicely, but most of the time Ellenberger was trying to time his right hand over the top of Perry's jab, or as Perry stepped in with the right hand. And it was a dangerous game Mike Perry was playing, because when he wasn't throwing out the jab or using those beautiful step-up left kicks, which you really don't see enough, like they're quite rare in MMA. Rambasomdet had an amazing one, but he used to go to the back leg. But Perry was using a step-up left kick to the inside of Ellenberger's lead leg, and also to the body, and he was changing them alternately. It looked really nice, and it was working really well. It was completely out of character with everything I've seen of Perry so far. And he was throwing a nice non-committal jab too. But then in between these, he would lunge with these long right hands and leaping left hooks, and he'd expose his chin completely on the way. So it was like, I wrote an article called The Duality of Mike Perry. It was like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing. There was all this stuff he clearly learned from the Joban fight, and then there was Platinum Mike trying to come through, getting those messages from God on the satellite. He's my favourite meme. He's meme-malicious. So yeah, that was a really good fight, and Perry was tuning him up with more technical striking. And then Ellenberger in the second round timed a right hand over the top of Perry's jab as Perry threw himself off balance. Perry falls on his hands. Ellenberger chases him to the fence, comes away, and blood is streaming out of Perry's face. Then Perry leaps in with the left hook that was getting him caught with counters the whole time, but it lands and knocks Ellenberger down. And then beautiful step up. Well, he ran into a step up kick to the body, landed in the clinch, and disconnected with an elbow on the break. And the elbow was gorgeous, left Ellenberger stiff. So Ellenberger's career resurgence really didn't last very long there. He seems to be back to just swinging his hands. You know, he threw the occasional nice body kick, but I was saying in the first round, Ellenberger needs to be throwing some low kicks here. You know, he's not worried about being taken down, and Perry's stance is so susceptible to it. But I looked at the fight metric afterwards, 0 strikes thrown to the legs by Ellenberger. So not only was he not kicking enough, he didn't kick the legs at all. Didn't even punch the legs. Yeah, so really strange performance from him, but really what we expect from Ellenberger at this point. You know, he's a guy who likes to swing his hands, and he doesn't really have that many tricks. You know, he brought 2 weapons to this fight, and the fight with Matt Brown was an amazing turnaround because he brought a new weapon that he hadn't shown before. And we can't really blame Edmund anymore because he's been working with... Well, apparently he only worked with Edmund for one camp, but he's been working with Rafael Cordero for a while, so he's working with good kickers. He's just not throwing the kicks. Meanwhile, Mike Perry really liked what he showed, but also really hated what he showed. It was because he showed 2 different sides to himself throughout the performance. You know, the leading with the chin and throwing the right hands and dropping his right hand down by his nips when he jumped in with the left hook each time. That's bad. But that won him the fight, whereas the technical stuff that I really enjoyed really only won him exchanges, didn't actually get him the knockout. But then this is that thing we were talking about with Robert Whittaker and what I'd like to see from Rumble and all sorts of other stuff. You know, if you have a guy who's naturally a big hitter and you teach him to fight for points, you know, you can throw in the occasional leaping left hook or whatever. You know, your standard point fighting techniques are going to hurt more than someone who can't punch as hard. And then if you throw the odd looping left hook or, you know, swinging overhand, you've got a good chance of it landing because then it's unusual. If it's all you do, then it's all people have to prepare for. Side note, Perry's takedown defense looked really good. Ellenberger was trying to time under his leaping punches, but the other thing about that is if Perry knows he's leaping in on a wrestler, he knows that he's going to have to be sprawling almost immediately or fighting off the takedown. And he did some nice knees on the break too. Ellenberger didn't go offensive with his takedowns at any point and didn't really show any setups or anything like that. He was just trying to time them exactly when Perry knew they were coming. OSP versus De Lima was desperate. Just 10 minutes of guys kicking from a range where they couldn't kick properly. De Lima kept throwing these kicks, missed most of them, and the thing was that OSP was doing the bouncing like short stance and then retracting his leg back into feet under him so that he could circle off. You see, you know, that's Dominic Cruz, Demetrius Johnson stuff, Wooly Pep stuff, but that stance is, that kind of movement is very susceptible to low kicks, but you have to step deeper. Because if you're targeting that lead leg when they're briefly in their stance and then they're going to pull it back anyway, you're never going to hit it. And De Lima was throwing at this leg and just missing and missing over and over again. If you're dealing with guys like that, you need to like double jab in, or you need to fake the kick and step in with the kick, or you need to lift your lead leg up and glide in behind it and then throw the kick. You know, get them moving back or almost towards the fence and then kick them. But De Lima was just throwing like, well, just out of nowhere and achieving nothing. And OSP was doing the same thing. You know, OSP, I very rarely enjoy OSP's fights because he's a 6'4" guy with all the like physical talent in the world, but he never throws more than one strike at once. The only times I've ever seen him throw combinations were the 2 times that he caught John Jones. And, you know, it was very clear that the fact that he threw, you know, a double jab and a right hand or whatever, was what caught John Jones out. He was just throwing 1 strike at a time the rest of the time, and that's been his entire career. And then he gasses in like the second round of every fight he's in. But he did Von Flue choke the guy again. As someone said on Reddit, at what point do we start calling it the OSP choke or the St. Preux choke? Because he's now finished 2 opponents with it. Someone was saying something interesting the other day about people hunting the Von Flue choke. If you can trap the arm, like you place your head under their arm from side control. And try and apply the Von Flue choke as if they were holding the guillotine. Because you noticed that De Lima had given up on the guillotine as soon as OSP started passing, but his hand was trapped in there. You know, he had one hand free trying to push away OSP's hips, but the hand that was around OSP's head was still trapped there by OSP's weight. So nice submission finish, janky ass fight. Do not care about light heavyweight in the UFC. Lausanne versus Ray was really enjoyable. Stevie Ray obviously the better boxer. Joe Lausanne obviously such a savvy vet on the ground. And what you saw really was that Stevie Ray was doing all the right things on the ground. He kept anytime that Lausanne tried to drive over the knee to half guard, Ray would be grabbing the hand near his head and pushing it away, making sure that he never got crossface, never got flattened out. And he was doing all the right things, but the thing is, that's where top and bottom position matter. If you're equally matched in the grappling, but there's lots of movement going on, and the top guy's allowed to throw strikes, suddenly it becomes a much worse situation for the bottom guy. The grappling was back and forth, but Lausanne was landing all the meaningful strikes. When they got to the feet, you saw Lausanne relying a lot on the double forearm guard. Not a lot of head movement, not a lot of footwork. And that's where Ray was really doing his business. If you can keep those forearms up, you can dig to the body. If you can keep those forearms up, you can put your hands on them and roll the elbow over. And elbows can sneak through between the arms, or you can grab the arm and fold with the elbow so that you're pulling it down out of the way. And that's really what you want to be doing against a guy who's covering up well or covering up effect. It's never a tremendously effective way to deal with strikes, but if all you're doing is aiming at the head with your punches, and the guy's decent at putting up his guard, you're going to struggle to make connections. So it was good to see Ray dig into the body with both hands, and throwing punches to the head, keep Lausanne's arms there, and then folding elbows over. You see so many guys waste their energy punching forearms when what you could be doing is punching the body, which is completely exposed, or elbowing the head in the more likely event of causing cuts, because if the guy's really chin down, gritted teeth waiting for the punches, you're not going to knock him out even if you sneak one through, probably. So it was good to see him folding the elbows over. Did wobble him in the end of the third round. What really decided it was the second round. Lausanne got the takedown with about 2 minutes left and had top control for the entire time, and he was sort of working, but not as much as in the first round. And then you're getting into judging criteria and so on. Certainly, if I were either corner going into the third round or the end of the third round, I would not feel confident in the result of the second round. Because even if they change the criteria, you're relying on the judges caring. And a lot of the time, judges aren't very consistent in what they think. But I enjoyed that fight. It was a 3-round decision, and if you were expecting Joe Lausanne, the great finisher, to come through with a quick submission, or Stevie Ray to blast the old guy out of there, maybe you'd be a little bit disappointed. But it was such a technical fight, and it was so enjoyable. So much going on, but I did live commentary for it, so you can go back and listen to that. I can't remember everything that happened, but I just remember a lot of it was Stevie Ray opening up his guard and trying to slide a knee in front to begin attacking a triangle from closed guard, and Lausanne would immediately step over it into headquarters position and start driving to half guard. But a really good fight nonetheless. And I think Stevie Ray could be one of those guys who surprises you, because he came in as such a hot prospect and he had a couple of slower fights against old veterans. And that's where guys like to write you off and be like, well, no, he's probably not as good as we all reckoned. But if he keeps it up and he keeps improving, he might surprise some people. He's got some interesting skills on the feet. Certainly it was those kicks that got him taken down, and his corner immediately told him stop throwing kicks. And then as soon as he threw another one, he got taken down again, which must be very frustrating for a cornerman. Then it was time to be depressed, as I said it on the broadcast. Sanchez versus Iaquinta. I expected Iaquinta to win this one because he's a very good striker and he hits hard. Whereas generally Sanchez gets into these brawls where a lot of how he wins these decisions is on judges who don't really register connections or notice misses and hits, and they just see him swinging wild. And the movement seems to give them the impression that he's working hard. You watch guys go to the fence with him swinging wildly at them. He can connect like 1 out of 10 punches, and the judges will think that was a really successful flurry. Sanchez came forward doing the alternate fist pumping and lunging with his chin out, as he always has. He's never been a good striker, even when he was fighting Clay Guida and throwing the same combination over and over again. And everyone was saying, oh my God, his striking looked so sharp in that fight. It's never improved. It's never gotten better. He's always been a great grappler who relies far too much on swinging hard and taking punches. So Iaquinta was looking for the lead hand control, stepping his lead foot outside of Sanchez's, securing the dominant line, and then Sanchez drops his right hand as it's being controlled, keying Iaquinta into the fact that something's coming, but rather than throwing the left straight, he's winding up his right hand all the way behind him. So he drops it a mile behind him, eats a left straight in the face, falls to the mat, comes up again, tries to throw a left straight, is beaten to the mark again. Very sad to watch, but I'm coming to accept that this is the way it has to be. There are guys who will fight unless they are savagely beaten out of the sport. And Diego Sanchez is in the middle of that because, immediately after this, he got on Instagram and was like, I'm okay, I'll get back on the horse, that's what warriors do. And I'm reading all these comments from his fans, and they're all like, yeah, you've still got it, keep going, man. Just awful. Stop encouraging him. He's so punchy now, and he's not getting any better. Someone was putting up footage of Chuck Liddell the other day, and he was a lot more coherent and well-spoken than he was when he retired. So, the effects of brain damage and punches to the head they're non-uniform, and also they're just very hard to gauge. But it was interesting to see that having taken all this time off fighting, he seems to be recovering his speech. But then, the Iceman was coked out of his head half the time, so you could never tell. Then in the main event, Swanson versus Lobos, after about the third round, it turned into Swanson sort of showing what he had, and Lobos was just looking for that same step back left counter. It was a good fight. Some people are saying that it was an incredible fight, but I know it set a record for second most strikes landed in the main event, which is crazy when you consider that the holder of that record is Nate Diaz versus Donald Cerrone, which was 3 rounds. So 10 minutes less, and they still landed the most strikes. But there were a couple of interesting looks. Cub did the left hook with the left kick off the same side, but he threw the high kick afterwards, caught him in the head. Nice counter elbow from Swanson at one point. Some interesting trips from the clinch and things like that, but a lot of what was really important, I thought, was Swanson throwing a lot of feints, because Lobos is just looking for people to step in, and then he'll step back with that left hand. And Swanson feinting a lot meant that he couldn't do that as well. But Lobos, a tough guy, and he did well for what was expected of him. I wrote an article about him before this, and I didn't like that he was being completely counted out, because Cub Swanson has been, even in that Do Ho Choi fight, that wasn't Cub coming back to show how technically superior he was to the other guy. That was a wild brawl. And that's not the sort of fight you want the aging fighter to be gearing his performances towards, So I thought if Cub steps in and just swings wild with this guy, he's going to get clipped with counters, and he did a few times. And Lobos surprised most with his work in the clinch and his couple of effective takedowns. As much as his record is that of a not very good fighter, he is a tough guy, and he's decently technical in the clinch and on the ground. And we are still at a stage in MMA where standing there and inviting the guy to come at you and then swinging back as he launches his punch is still a viable tactic. Anderson Silva was getting away with it in 2006, 7, 8, and it still works because most guys don't understand how feinting works in MMA, at least. But not for me, not an amazing fight, but some people really loved it. I thought it was better than I expected. But, Swanson's not going to get a title fight off that. That would be bizarre. Anyway, let's do some questions. Hey Jack, do you believe that in MMA as a sport, the level of athletes who compete in it and the compensation for fighters has peaked? The speculation on forums after the Iaquinta fight is that the Fertitta brothers sold the promotion partly because they knew the popularity of MMA had reached its height. The main opinion in the debate was that the top athletes will never come over to MMA due to the low rate of pay and the expected long-term injuries and brain damage that comes with being a fighter. I personally believe there is still room for growth within the sport. Any thoughts on this would be appreciated. Thanks as always for the podcast and the Fightland articles, Ian. That's an interesting point. I think the Fertittas did see a great time to sell, because with Rousey and McGregor selling alternate pay-per-views, they had that's 2 stars, and that's millions of dollars and a perception that MMA is suddenly big time. So if someone was going to give you $4.2 billion for that, you'd be like, all right, you mug. Because nothing in this business can be counted on, and that's what's happening with the WME model at the moment. It seems to be that they're working on creating stars and not really having a backup when things go tits up. Whereas in the old days of Zuffa, when it was sort of like almost a meritocracy, it's never been a complete meritocracy, but when it was almost a meritocracy, you just rolled with whatever punches you were given promotionally. If you're relying on the star power of Ronda Rousey or the girl who beats Ronda Rousey, suddenly you're hamstrung whenever people start losing, and you can't predict the results of fights. Like, Michelle Waterson was about to get the big push, and then that all fell through when Rose Namajunas beat her up. Same thing with Paige, same thing with Sage. I think what the Fertitta brothers saw was that this sport, there's still potential for this sport to grow enormous, because what we need is stars like this to bring the sport to popularity. But I think they also saw that they were not in the position that they could keep replicating those sales. They were having an exceptionally good time, and people apparently bought this business with the expectation that it was just going to be all up from now on. In terms of athletes coming over, I think with the increasing popularity of the sport and the increasing popularity of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and things like that, I think with kids getting into it younger and younger, you're going to see people coming into it more athletic, or better athletes coming into it than before. You know, we still have guys in the UFC who came into grappling or whatever as adults and had successful careers as fighters. You can't take up football or basketball as an adult and get to the standard that you're on a professional team. I mean, I'm sure there are some very rare examples of that happening. But like the other day when Rumble said he was going to be doing something involved with football, and people were like, "Oh my God, is he going to be playing for the Rams?" You're like, "What the fuck is that?" You know, the NFL has the most ridiculous scouting process in the world. You know, the whole combine, and there are trainers who are paid to shave seconds off people's 40-yard dash and various other activities that they do specifically for the combine. And you think some guy who did all right in MMA is just going to walk in and be on a professional football team. It's just bizarre. But anyway, yeah, I think you're going to see guys coming up through the sport who enjoy grappling, naturally higher level of athleticism. What you're going to see is less people going to MMA because they think, oh my God, I could make so much money in MMA, rather than the NFL or whoever else has offered me scholarships and shit. What you're going to see more often is probably guys who really excel at BJJ, and through an extension of that go, okay, well now I could try some MMA, or I could make some money doing MMA. Maybe one day we'll have real, like, top quality athletes coming through, but I think what you'll see probably more is more like boxing, where most of the really athletic boxers are guys in lower weight classes because they're not going to be picked for team sports where there aren't weight classes. You know, you only need to watch the Olympics in the lower weight classes and the high weight classes to see the obvious difference between the talent on show and the level of athleticism. But I don't want to say that MMA's done growing, because I don't want to think that, you know. But I think Conor McGregor is only going to help the growth of MMA. But I think once he has a couple of losses or retires or disappears or whatever, WME are going to struggle to follow up on that. I think in a few years' time, the guys who've been influenced by Conor McGregor and the massive growth of MMA over the last couple of years, that's when we're going to start feeling like the increase in popularity again. And I think all I'm really saying is I think that there's going to be a post-McGregor slump in the popularity of MMA, and we're all going to be going, oh my God, we peaked. And then at some point in the future, things will get a little bit better than even the best days of Conor McGregor, probably. But, you know, the fight game generally is a boom and bust sport. Anyway, thanks for that, Ian. Right, to finish up today, I wanted to talk about a fight of the week. I suppose it's really two fights of the week, but I realised that the entire time that I've been covering mixed martial arts, I've been pretty down on Diego Sanchez. And that's because since I've been covering mixed martial arts, he has been in a very obvious decline. However, when I began watching mixed martial arts, well, he wasn't around yet, but when he turned up on the scene, he was something remarkable. So we're going to be doing a sort of a career eulogy for Diego Sanchez, even though he'll probably hang around another 5 years, pick up a couple of wins, and I'm sure some fans will be like, oh my God, Diego's back, when he does. But my fight of the week this week is Nick Diaz versus Diego Sanchez. I rewatched it today, and it's amazing how well the grappling holds up. If you watch a lot of fights from that same era, I mean, this was 2005, so if you watch a lot of fights from that same era, the grappling is very stunted. It's all closed guard and like flat half guard with a little bit of knee shield, and there's not an awful lot of really dynamic grappling exchanges. This fight is important because it's Diego Sanchez taking on a really high-level pro for the first time in the UFC. He'd come in off The Ultimate Fighter, and Nick Diaz apparently felt rather poorly about that. But what's remarkable in this fight is the pace that Sanchez kept and put on Nick Diaz. I mean, how often can you say someone put the pace on Nick Diaz? Took him down right from the get-go, and most of the fight happened from inside Diaz's guard. And this is a great fight to display Diego Sanchez's pace and the kind of intensity that he brings to a fight. It's also a great fight for Nick Diaz's guard. If you watch Nick Diaz's guard in this fight, it's really modern. Like, he's inverting a lot, he's up on his shoulders a lot, he uses the Kimura to try and take the back a lot. Nick Diaz's guard attacks are usually just that armbar, or trying to get to the turtle and roll out, or stand up. But in this fight, his guard retention is really on point. It looks very, very similar to what it looked like against George St. Pierre. Even though a lot of the fight against George St. Pierre, Diaz was actually throwing his legs past St. Pierre and looking to come up to the turtle instead. But there's all sorts of things like the roll-unders from the Granby rolls from Turtle, and inversions to maintain his guard. And I was just really impressed by how familiar it looked, given how much the BJJ scene has changed over the last 10 years. These guys are looking quite familiar to the modern game. The other fight that I wanted to include this week on Fight of the Week was Diego Sanchez versus Cairo Persian, which is another really great high-paced fight. Diego Sanchez's striking has always been hot garbage. I mean, if you watch the Diaz fight, he's diving on these shots and getting punched. If you watch the Parisian fight, he's loading up punches and getting punched while he's throwing them. He never really learns to avoid the strikes, but his grappling style is so unique and interesting. And I think that's because he was a high school state champion. Never went to a college team or anything like that. So he got out of wrestling quite early and went to work for UPS, and found Greg Jackson's gym and became one of their first really big standouts. But I think it was that thing about being a good wrestler, or a very good wrestler if you're a state champion, in the grand scheme of the population. He's not going to be like a guy who's on the way to the Olympics if he hadn't dropped out or something like that. But someone who's a much better than average wrestler, but doesn't stay in wrestling as long as some of these guys who we see coming to MMA from, Daniel Cormier or King Mo or someone like that, people who've been to the Olympics or have basically lived out their whole wrestling career and then are falling back on mixed martial arts. What you saw with Diego was a guy who was a very skilled wrestler, but then started in the submission grappling and stuff very early in his life, and the two really played into each other. I mean, he's hitting duck outs from his back, and he's coming up to turtle and hitting peek outs and then falling to his back to take the back. He's shooting in on guys coming up on their back and then trying to crab ride them. He's doing all these interesting pairings of good wrestling and good fluid jiu-jitsu. And it does make you wonder. It makes you wonder if you stay in wrestling too long and you spend basically a whole competitive lifetime in wrestling, do you become too solid in your wrestling style? Daniel Cormier and Ben Askren or King Mo too. I could not. It's hard to imagine them developing the kind of stuff from the bottom that Diego Sanchez went on to do. But the Cairo Persian fight is fantastic because right from the start he gets on Cairo Persian, smashes his eyelid open, and he starts bleeding, and Cairo Parisian's talking to Big John McCarthy as Diego Sanchez is mounting him and taking his back in the first few seconds of the fight. It looked like Parisian didn't even want to be there to begin with. But then he gets out of back control and he hits a beautiful judo throw, like both of them right on their head. He drops Diego on his head a few times in this fight. There is no Diego Sanchez fight where he's not taking a good amount of brain trauma. Another interesting thing about the Parisian fight is that Parisian's hitting these beautiful throws that, might be an ippon in judo. But if you watch like high-level judo, you'll see guys hit perfect throws. They'll get the full point. That'll be the end of the match. But the throw would have ended up with them giving up their back, or they're landing on top of their opponent, but their back is to the opponent, or they've still got a lot of momentum as they roll through. And that was what was happening in this fight. Parisian's hitting these beautiful judo throws, and you'd give him full marks for aesthetics, but then Sanchez would just roll through and try and come up on his back or come up on top. It's also the fight where Diego knees him right in the teeth and one of his teeth comes out. Actually, in the Nick Diaz fight, there is a moment where Nick Diaz is trying to come up from guard and grab a hold of Sanchez's waist. Sanchez stands up and knees him in the face while he's sat on the mat. And the whole crowd goes, ooh, and Big John doesn't say anything about it. So I don't know if he hit him in the chest or something, but it was a nice knee at any rate. And Diego Sanchez could have been probably a much better pure grappler than he ended up being. If you watch his Abu Dhabi match with Marcelo Garcia, this is like prime Marcelo Garcia. And Diego Sanchez does a very respectable job. Almost mounts Marcelo at one point. They have a good back and forth roll, and then finally Marcelo, I think, armbars him. That's well worth a watch. And he wears those orange shorts that look like they've just been bought down Dick's Sporting Goods or something. The tap-out shorts that were bright orange. And that's my image of Diego Sanchez. I don't even remember how many fights he wore those for, but he wore them for the Nick Diaz bout and that Marcelo Garcia match, and that's why I just remember him as those orange shorts. One of the interesting things to think about is that when Diego beat Cairo Persian, Cairo had just dropped out of a title fight with Matt Hughes. I think he pulled his hamstring quite badly or something like that. And then Diego trounced him. And you're thinking Diego could have been, it would have been interesting to see what Diego could have done against Matt Hughes when Matt Hughes was the champion. Because a lot of Diego's game was taking guys down, and you don't know if he would be able to get Matt Hughes down, but certainly I believe Sanchez was better from bottom positions and better at scrambling than Matt Hughes. And I think the wilder that Sanchez could have made that match, the better chance he would have had at either sweeping Matt Hughes or grabbing a hold of something and forcing Matt Hughes to his back. Certainly if there was a match that Diego Sanchez could win on the feet, it would be Matt Hughes. But shortly after that, George St. Pierre beat Matt Hughes for the title, and we sort of moved into the George St. Pierre era, and the modern era, I suppose. At any rate, both fights are well worth your time, but the Nick Diaz one especially, for just how fluid and modern the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu looks throughout. We don't have any fights this weekend, but the schedule I've written myself for the coming weeks is that I wrote Jędrzejczyk versus Andrade yesterday. I'll be writing something on Edgar versus Rodriguez tomorrow, I think. And then we got Maia versus Masvidal, Miocic versus Dos Santos, and Alvarez versus Poirier, all to talk about next week because UFC 211 is on May 13th, and that looks really good. And then May 19th, we got the amazing Bellator card. I might still try and buy a ticket for that, actually. I'd go along as press, but you have to sign a thing that says you won't drink. And, for a Bellator undercard, I probably need that. Anyway, I've been your boy Jack Slack. Sign up to the Patreon to support this podcast and the new alternate commentaries, which I will be trying to carry forward as a brand. I don't know, as a thing that I'm doing now. We'll have a new history episode coming probably within the next week or two. Send your emails and questions and queries and hypothetical fights and rants to fightsgonepodcast@gmail.com. I'll catch you next week, and remember, say your prayers, brush your teeth, supplement your taint. Cheers.